So here are the steps that you need to follow to be able to round up. Step number 1 is find your pivot, and I'll talk about what I mean by pivot in a second. Step number 2 is look to the one on right, which means that look to the one on the right side of the pivot. Step number 3 is if the one on the right side is smaller than 5, then pivot stays same. However, if it's bigger or equal to 5, then you add 1 to the pivot. The last step is anything to the right of the pivot becomes 0. So these steps are really easy and simple to follow. There's really nothing complicated about them. So if you follow them, you will be able to round up to any significant figure or any decimal places as you like. So let's put those words into action now. I'm just going to pick a random number, let's say 48,515. And we want to round it to one significant figure. So rule number 1 says find your pivot, but how in the world do you know what the pivot is? So you refer back to this here, and it says one significant figure. So the 1 tells you what your pivot will be. So you look to the number that you have and the first digit. The first digit is a 4. So the 4 is your pivot. Rule number 2 says look to 1 to the right side of the pivot. And in this case, it's 8. The next step said if this number here is smaller than 5, the pivot stays the same. However, if it's bigger or equal to 5, you add 1 to the pivot. Okay? And in this case, because it's an 8 and it's clearly bigger than 5, so you add 1 to the pivot. So your answer will be 5, 0, 0, 0, 0. This is the last step here. So anything else to the right side of the pivot automatically becomes a 0. So this is how you will round it up to one significant figure. Let's do 2 significant figures now. So how do you know what your pivot is? 2. So it will be the second digit that will now become your pivot. Look to 1 to the right side of 5. Anything smaller than 5 stays same. Anything bigger or equal to 5, you add 1 to the pivot. Okay? So because it is a 5, you add 1 to the pivot. So you add 1 to 8. So that becomes a 9. Anything to the right side of the pivot becomes a 0. But don't forget your 4. You just leave your 4 there. So you've got your 2 significant figures. Now let's do 3 significant figures because there's a 3 here. So you look at the third digit. Third digit is 5. So 5 in this case is your pivot point. Look to 1 to the right side of the pivot point. This is a 1. And it's clearly smaller than 5. So the pivot stays the same. So the 5 stays same. Anything else on the right side becomes a 0. The left side, it stays the same. Okay, so now you've got your 3 significant figures and the rest are zeros, and you've done the question. So we've had a look at significant figures. Now let's have a look at decimal places, okay? I'm going to pick a random number again. 21.568, and let's say we want to round it up to 1 decimal place. So how do we know what the pivot point is in this case scenario? Now just because it says a 1 here doesn't mean that it's the first digit here. It means it's the first digit after the decimal point, and in this case it's the 5. So 5 is your pivot point. Look 1 to the right side, you've got your 6, and like the rule said, that anything smaller than 5 stays same. Anything bigger or equal to 5, you add 1 to the pivot point, okay? The rules or the steps or whatever you want to call them, they work the same way except for the pivot point. In decimal places, the pivot point is always after the decimal point, okay? So we found a pivot point. 1 to the right is a 6, clearly bigger than 5. You add 1 to the pivot. So add 1 to 5 and you get a 6. Anything on the right side becomes a 0. You've got your decimal point, and then anything on the left, you just write it down. That doesn't change. Anything on the left doesn't change. Anything on the right becomes a 0. In real life or in exams, you will not write it like this. You will just write it like 21.6 because this is same as writing this. So you don't need to write the extra zeros down because that and that have the same value. Now let's say we want to round it up to 2 decimal places. Again, your decimal point, so this will be your first one, second one. This is your pivot point. Look, 1 to the right is 8, clearly bigger than 5. You add 1 to the pivot. So that becomes 7. Anything on the right side is a 0. Everything on the left stays the same, okay? And this here is same as writing 21.57. So you will just leave it like this, okay? And also because it says 2 decimal places, so this is 2 decimal places, okay? If you have any questions about anything in the video, don't forget to comment below and let me know your queries. Thanks for watching.